Coming to you live from the city of Port Phillip. Welcome to the first edition of Marcus Pearl Talks for 2025, and wishing you and your family all the very best for this year. I hope it's prosperous and successful for you and your family. And we also hope that for the city of Melbourne, city of Port Phillip, city of Stonington, wherever you're joining us from here tonight. And thank you to the few people that have come in to the program early in January. As always, if you've got any questions, you've got any comments, you got any hate mail, feel free to leave a comment on YouTube or Facebook as we're broadcasting live at the moment. Or if you've got any questions, comments, feel free to contact me anytime at hello@marcuspell.com or 0478 136 762. So tonight's program is just me. There's no co-host this evening, and it's all about having a little peek into the review of the 2024 City of Port Phillip Council election donations. This is the intriguing thing. There's a requirement under the Local Government Act and the Local Government Inspectorate under the elections to ensure that everybody that's received a donation above a certain threshold, which we'll go through in a moment, is declared 40 days after the election and published 40 days after the election, rather. And that was done just before Christmas or in between Christmas and New Year by the city of Port Phillip. Let's have a look at what's required in terms of the actually what has to be done by candidates at an election campaign. And it's very clear here, all monetary donations equal to or over the value of $500 or any donations in kind in support equal to or over $500 also need to be declared. So that's cash donations that are provided directly to candidates, and also in-kind donations such as letterboxing, billboards, offices, for example. Any form of assistance that would have a monetary value over $500 need to be disclosed by candidates to ensure integrity. Now, first things first that probably should be talked about here is election donations are a reality, and they're an important reality of any election campaign. It takes time, it takes connections, and it takes money and campaigning to win elections. So nothing that's gone through this episode here this evening should be viewed as negative or disparaging of people raising money. I've done it myself. Lots of people have done it. You have to do it to get elected. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to run a decent campaign to get your message to people, to be able to influence them to determine that why you are the best person to represent them at any level of government, including the local government level. But these are the rules that all candidates have to abide by in terms of the levels of which they need to disclose their donations to. Let's have a look quickly at the total amount of donations that were provided at this election versus the last election. And the information that's been provided in tonight's show comes from the City of Port Phillip website, a little bit from the Local Government Inspectorate, which we'll talk about in a moment, and also a great resource which you should all use, which is Greg Day's website, TWISC, This Week in Security. If you Google that, you'll find lots of local information and news and events on the City of Port Phillip Council, and also particularly pertaining to St Kilda. But let's get back to the data here in terms of what was disclosed in the total donations disclosed by candidates at this election. We saw at the 2020 election, which was a very different election in terms of it was in the middle of COVID lockdowns in November 2020, $134,245 was declared above the $500 amount, or declared by candidates rather, in that election campaign. A 45% increase or thereabouts was experienced in this election, taking the total to $195,000, which is an enormous amount of money. Keep in mind, this is not the amount that was spent on the election. This is the amount that candidates raised and disclosed for the election. So the amount that was actually spent on the election was vastly higher than this. In fact, there's some estimates that some candidates probably spent several tens of thousands of dollars in their attempts to get elected. But obviously, under the current rules, if you're spending your own money, the way I read it is it doesn't need to be disclosed. What I would say is in the City of Melbourne election, however, a number of people have disclosed their contribution, which I think is the way it should be. If you're self-funding your campaign, you still should have an obligation to people to disclose that, of which candidates were free to do that. Not many did it in this election campaign. In fact, I'll give a shout out to those people in the future of who did actually disclose. So significant increase from the 2020 election to the 2024 election in terms of the total amount of money disclosed under these donation returns. Let's have a look at who raised that money and where it came from. 36% of the $195,000 was raised by the residents of Port Phillip, formerly the ratepayers of Port Phillip. The Greens political party, who endorsed candidates in most wards in the city of Port Phillip, raised 33% of the total amount declared. PEPP raised 15%. Independents accounted for under 9%, and the ALP, who also endorsed, accounted for less than 7.3%. But I have more to say about that in a moment. Let's have a look again. Thank you to Greg Day, who's done this data for us. Let's have a look at the total amount that was raised from group funding or party funding and versus individual funding, which shows an interesting context here that should be looked at reasonably closely, I think. The ratepayers of Port Phillip, their total funding wallet that was declared by their endorsed candidates was $70,000, just under $71,000. The vast majority of that was from the residents of Port Phillip, and a small amount, which I'll get to in a moment, was one $3,500 donation thereabouts that was provided to Brian Mayers by another action group. The Greens, vast majority of that was obviously in the blue was party funded, so the contributions that were then donated to the Greens and then provided to their candidates came in at $63,000 or thereabouts, and PPP came in at $29,000. Most of that was in the red there, what I call individually funded, which was predominantly Serge Taman's individual fundraising. He received the single largest donation by one of his associates of about $15,000. Which was fully disclosed if you want to look the details of that up. Independents, as I said before, accounted for a smaller amount, $17,000 in total, and the ALP came in, well, ALP candidate declared donations came in at only $14,269. So again, the blue graph here, for those of you joining us online, show the amount that was provided by what I call groups or SuperPacs or political parties to candidates then declared. The red part of the graph of the total is individuals that have been declared above the $500 amount on the returns. Keep in mind, this is not the full amount that was spent on the election campaign. It's just the amount that the candidate has declared in their electoral return. Let's have a look at the elected councillors and to see how much they individually declared on their returns. I've put these numbers here so you can see them clearly. Under no means do I mean to infer that these councillors are for sale at all. In fact, this is just a receipt of what they declared on their returns. Betty J on the far left there declared $18,000. Heather Consolo, the former mayor, declared $200. Serge Taman at the front there was the highest amount that was declared in his return at $23,500. Louise Crawford, the current mayor, declared $1,300. Brian Mayers from the residents of Port Phillip declared $17,000, and so did the councillor for Albert Park Ward, also from the residents of Port Phillip, Rod Hardy declared $17,000, and Libby Buckingham $2,200. Councillor Alex Macon declared $0, so I'm assuming he self-funded his campaign, and also Justin Halliday also declared $0 amount. So there's the amount that the elected councillors declared on their electoral returns. Interesting to note that two of them have declared $0, so they either self-funded their campaign or had donations below the $500 amount. I would say I do know a number of campaigns that declared zero on their returns, that spent sizable amounts of money, to say the least, but we don't know exactly what that was. One interesting thing to have a look at, which I've talked about before here, is what I call the SuperPac. So a SuperPac in America is a group that pulls funds together and then donates that money to candidates or political parties. And we've seen that used here in the city of Port Phillip and in other areas. Again, this is completely within the rules, but it does provide a grey area about transparency about who and where this money came from. So none of the figures I've talked about here before include donations from Progressive Port Phillip, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It does include, obviously, the ratepayers of Port Phillip have been very transparent. Residents of Port Phillip have been very transparent about the amount of money they've contributed to their individual candidates, but we don't know exactly where that money comes through, but you never know. They might make that transparent at some point in the future. Let's have a look at what these two major groups raised. Now, Progressive Port Phillip's information has been able to be gained by Greg Day at Twisk, and Progressive Port Phillip declared that they raised $21,978, or that's what they spent on their election campaign activities, informing locals, running sessions, and also letterboxing, I think, roughly 60,000 homes with voter indication cards, which I'll get to in a moment. The residents of Port Phillip raised and contributed directly $67,412 to their individual candidates. There were two other groups also that contributed, which we don't have the details to necessarily, which was the PPP, which is the Serge Taman-led group of independents. They disclosed to Twist that they held two fundraising events to raise the money that was distributed to their candidates. Again, they indicated 150 people went to one event, 100 went to another. So, that's one other group that also contributed. I'm not sure if PPP is incorporated. The fourth group was a group that was disclosed to one of the ROP candidates, Brian Mayers, which was the Queens Lane Residents Action Group of $3,500 contribution to him. This will be interesting to see how this is dealt with from a conflict of interest point of view. Obviously, Councillor Mayers is a keen advocate for Queens Lane and the surrounding areas. But as you can see here in the description of who this group is that I found on the internet, they focus on Queens Lane and also the postcode 3004. So where this money came from, I'm not 100% sure, but it'll be interesting to see how Councillor Mayers handles his conflict of interest obligations when considering issues around and advocating for issues around Queens Lane, given that he's received these funds. Now, back to the PPP or Progressive Port Phillip activities that were put out. We know that they've disclosed that they spent over $20,000 on the election campaign and raised. They haven't disclosed where that money came from, but they did issue these style of cards, advisory cards advising how people should vote. This is an example of one. To my knowledge, the permission wasn't sought from people to get this tacit endorsement, so to speak, from Progressive Port Phillip. But there were, I do know, a number of people, council candidates rather, that were going to PPP events to try and obviously put forward what their candidacy was and show how that aligned with PPP. What we had in this election was 4 ROP endorsed candidates who have disclosed the amounts of money they received from the residents of Port Phillip, and there were 20 people on the PPP advisory tickets that received some support from PPP. One of which was obviously on the board also. None of these 20 people disclosed that they received any support from PPP. Again, if I was one of those 20 people, I'm not saying that they have to, I'm not a lawyer, but if I was certainly one of those 20 people, I would have disclosed that there was a benefit. And the way I've calculated that is PPP have determined that they spent just over $20,000. Divide that by the 20 people that were put on the advice card, even though that you know those 20 people, there's no evidence that any of them wanted to be on that card necessarily in terms of formal endorsement. But by my rough calculation, if I was on that card, I would have received a benefit of just over $1,000. And under the rules on the second dot point, all donations of kind and equal or at or above $500 should be declared. I would have declared that in my return, but we haven't seen that from any of those people from what I could see, but that may change in future weeks, etc. So there is an overview of where the money was spent or raised, rather. We don't know where it was spent, and we also don't know how much individual councillors or council candidates, rather, spent on their campaign. But what you're seeing here is, I would estimate at least double this again would have been spent. So probably somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 was spent trying to get your vote, is my estimate. I have no evidence to back that up. It's just a rough estimate on what I feel people may have spent on their campaigns to win your vote in the 2024 campaign. Again, I just want to make the point that I don't think there's anything wrong with raising money for election campaigns. People just need to know where that money came from, which I think is perfectly reasonable to do so. And from what I can see and gather from the evidence provided, that all council candidates, other than the couple that didn't submit a return at all, which I think is questionable, that should be looked into, have complied with the regulations. But what I have said is, if I was one of the people that received my name on one of those PPP cards, I would have personally disclosed that, because that's my personal preference. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the obligation of those people to do that, but we'll soon find out, so to speak. So there is your update. Again, wishing you a very happy new year. Welcome back. We'll have another show next week. Next week's show will be an interesting one, in that we're going to answer a couple of questions which I should have answered in the new year. The obvious one that we'll talk about is, how big was the donkey vote in the last 2024 council election. And then from there, a couple of your questions that you've sent through, which what's going on in your local neighbourhood. So welcome to the new year. If you've got any questions, comments or complaints, feel free to send me an email, send me or give me a phone call. Happy to hear from you. Talk to you soon.